Hello, it is the middle of November, which means it's time for the third quarter review. Okay, let's be realistic. This third quarter review should have been done a month and a half ago. It is a truth universally acknowledged that I can never do this thing on time, but I swear one of these days, maybe that'll be a goal for next year, I will do these at the end of the actual quarter. This third quarter went from July to September, and naturally we're in the middle of the next quarter, as I am prone to do, but I don't care because I love looking at my stats. So if you don't know, now you know, I like to track my stats. This series of videos was inspired by Books and Lala, but I do love to follow my stats. It's important to me just because I like doing it, but also because I think it helps me reflect on my reading and how I'm reading and how I can improve on the diversity of my reading. First things first, I'm a realist. I read 56 books this quarter. That is compared to like maybe 50 books last quarter, and I want to say about 60 books the first quarter. I do read a lot, naturally, but it's worth saying I read primarily by audiobook, and I listen like at nearly double speed most of the time. So let's think about the genres that I read. Let me refer to my phone while I have all my stats. This was objectively the worst month for genres, and I say that relatively speaking. I mean, I read a majority sci-fi, and I love sci-fi. I also love horror and fantasy, hence those two being the next highest that I read. But it's important to me that I don't overwhelm myself with one sect of books. I try to read a variety of different books, and that's been evident by my previous stats, which I'll have linked below and in the cards. But I think part of this is that I had a lot of rereads, but I'll get to that in a second. What else I read was I read a bit of nonfiction, which is normal, but a little bit less than I usually do, and I didn't read a lot of general fiction. Like contemporary was my next highest, but barely any literary fiction, historical, or classics, which is very problematic because those are two areas of books, two genres of books that I really want to try and push through, because I do have books in those that I want to read as well. Now, looking at the ratings, I had a lot of 5 and 4 star books. I don't know if this is a problem with how I'm rating. Maybe I'm being too generous as the year goes along, or maybe it was just a really good quarter. I think it's important for us to remember that big sect of books that were sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, that was over half of what I read. When it comes to those 3 genres, which are my favorite genres, I think it's easier for me to recognize what I'll like. And so when I'm gravitating towards those books, it's easier for me to know beforehand whether or not I'm going to like a book. Meaning, I'm less likely to pick up a book I don't like if it's in my favorite genre, because I know those genres better. These other genres I like, but I'm less familiar with them, so I'm still sort of testing the water, you know. And when I pick up those books, I maybe more often hit or miss, because I need to figure out what I like and what I don't like. So I guess it's okay that I did that. I still don't like that I rate so many books so high, because I feel like I'm not being decisive enough, not being critical enough. But you know what? If I enjoy it, I enjoy it, right? Thinking about length here, I don't think much has changed here. I did read a lot of novellas in July and other months, so that's why that 100 to 200 is fairly high, but on average it's probably about 350 or 300, which is normal. I do like long books, and I don't like that I did not read a lot of 600 plus page books, but I think I'll make those up in other months. I keep telling myself I want to read more long books than short books, but that's kind of a hard thing to do when, obviously, when I'm trying to think about what I want to read, it's easy to pick up a bunch of small books than to let one long book dominate my month, if that makes sense. And so it's like you have to find the right balance of long books, but also still making room for other books, not letting these long books just dominate my entire TBR. Now, thinking about a few other things, let's think about the authors. If you look at the gender of the authors, this does not look great, but I will say things are better than they have been in previous quarters. I have the best split between cis women and cis men than I normally do, and I technically read more non-binary and trans authors than I ever had before in past quarters, but this is still the single most metric that I need to fix, that I need to address. I have other ones I'm going to talk about in a second, but this is the one where I really struggled to find authors that are non-binary and trans, or at least to make a point to pick up those books. And I think maybe when I think about what to do moving forward, maybe at the very least I should be able to pick up at least one book a month to ensure that I am at least exposing myself regularly to that particular perspective. In the same vein, I've read nearly a quarter queer books, which to me would classify as like a queer main character or a queer central plot, which usually means it has a queer main character. But this has improved since the year started, but it's still one of those things where I want to do better. What would my ideal goal here be? 50-50, honestly. At least 50% of the books I read should be queer, because as a queer person, I want to be able to experience a range of different queer views. Even though I'm a queer person, it's still an underrepresented perspective that in my reading, and that's a problem for me. In another vein, we have the ethnicity or race of the authors. This one is okay. I got over a quarter of people of color, with the majority Black authors, and then Latinx and Indigenous. There are other underrepresented groups that are not on this list that I am still working to address. This is another thing that I've been working to improve on, and it's one of those things where it's hard to address because there are such a range of underrepresented groups, and I'm constantly trying to stop and reflect on what I'm reading and who I'm not reading, because it's important to me that I read more than just white authors, but also more than just one particular group of people of color. There are so many different perspectives that I am missing out on that are underrepresented in my reading that I am striving to get at. And I think what I tend to do is I'll look at these quarterly stats, and then the next quarter I'll think about who I didn't address and I'll go there. But I think I would like to get to them more regularly, but there's just such a breadth of different perspectives that I'm trying to get to that it's hard to tackle them every month. Now, moving on to years published. So I say this for last because I want to talk about my backlist in a second, but if you look here, I guess I don't have a good way of judging if this is good or bad, but there's been a definite spike in the amount of new books that I read, books published in 2020. And I think part of this is just that I've gotten more comfortable on my channel. Like, it is a sense that I started out the year with particular goals of trying to strive to get to something, and since then my focus has been less on those goals and more on fun ideas I could do for my channel. And because of that, that often gets to me buying new books, or whether they're backlist or books published this year. And I think there's a balance there. Do I have it? I'm not quite sure yet. I don't think I have a problem with reading backlist in general. The real problem is this. Let's look at this graph now, where essentially the books that I'm reading, not just what year were they published, but how long have I owned them. Now, remember before I said I read primarily by audio. If you're new here, that means the reason I still have these books is because I like to buy them, to own them on hand after I read them. And because I have so many books on my shelf that I haven't read or listened to, it is a goal of mine to only or primarily read books that are on my shelf. And particularly among that, I want to read books that I've owned the longest, or that are on my shelf the longest without being read. That's where I get this graph from, the TBR shelf of books that I've owned before 2020. Then you have books that are new in 2020, which is to say I bought them in 2020. And these are books that could have been published years ago. They could have been used when I bought them, but I've gotten them fairly new. And I've been trying to figure out, how do I effectively address how long I'm owning a book? How well am I addressing my backlist versus just reading a bunch of new books that are fresh in my mind, and basically all the flashy things that are coming into my life, versus books that have been on my shelf for so long that I need to either get to or get rid of, one or the other. But I'll touch more on that in a second. Other than that, I had a lot of rereads. I don't mind that. I like rereading more. I do think there's a balance to be had. I had a lot of rereads this quarter, but not other quarters. And then Unknown. These are books that are either books that I read for a book club or books that I read for an e-arc. So if I don't own them on my shelf, usually I have to get an e-arc to justify either reading the e-arc or just getting the audiobook if it's already been published. I'm okay with this too, because it usually means I'm improving my NetGalley score. I do think I do have a problem though of requesting too many NetGalley books. Let's go back to this question of how long are books sitting on my shelf before I read them. And for this, I've been really struggling with how to address this problem. And I finally got to a point where I think I really found a good way of visualizing what I'm reading and how well it's addressing my backlist. So let's look at this graph here. What you're looking at is essentially a histogram of how many books I read versus how long I owned them. On this x-axis, the bottom axis here, we're looking at how many years I owned them. And they go up to 5 years, is that right? 5 or 6 years? Over 5 years. And so I read some books that I've owned for quite a while, like 5 books in the last 3 months, from this 3-month span. And I think that's pretty good. But as you can see, the majority of the books I read, I've owned for less than a year, and a shit ton of them, which is to say 16 books it looks like, were read right after I bought them, which means I bought them and they were like within a month I immediately read them, which isn't a bad thing if we think about it. If it's like 15 books spread across 3 months, that means every month if I read 15 books, a third of them were brand new books. It isn't everything I'm reading, but it could be better, and it should be better. Now, respective to what I actually own, it's important to ask myself, are there a bunch of old books in my TBR that I'm not getting to? And that's why I made this new graph, which is slightly different, but again, what I read this quarter is in red, and the books on my TBR shelf are in blue, except instead of doing numbers here, we're looking at percentage. So like the books that I read that were brand new this quarter, about 50% of the books I read this quarter were that. That's what the 0.5 means. As opposed to, like, as you can see, the majority of the books I own on my shelf that I haven't read in blue are about 1 year or less. I have a lot less that are older books, and I think if I continually read 1 or 2 books a month that are older than 2 years, I'll actually get to those pretty quickly. But if I keep buying books, of course, we'll have a serious problem of my TBR shelf getting way bigger than I can actually tackle. That's the real problem here. I think I'm doing a decent job getting my backlist. That's what this figure tells me. And I want to say how happy I am with this figure. I was really, really happy when I was able to put this together. It took a lot of work because I had to figure out the age of the book, basically when I bought them, and then figure out the date that I read them, respectively. All in all, I like the result. I like that I did this because it really tells me, hey Josh, you're actually doing a decent job reading your backlist, but you should do a little bit less reading brand new books. And I was like, okay, I learned, I moved forward, and I have something pretty to look at. Look at this beautiful graph. I'm so happy with it. Yes, I'm proud. That's the gist. Yeah, those are the books that I read. It's my quarterly review. I can't wait to get this for my yearly review. I'm really excited to just to look back, think of everything that I read, and how I can improve moving forward. But as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and hope you have a great day. Until next time, goodbye.